Hi, my name's Kate. Thank you to Rebecca and the team for inviting me to participate. I'm sorry that I'm so far away. I want to get to the crux of my thinking, but I want to first acknowledge that I've done this thinking with my colleague, Kim Snepvangers. We both apologise that we can't be there. We both loved our time on World Council, and as two Australian colleagues living close but far from each other, we developed a really great relationship. And the preface of much of our work was this concept of the decolonised curriculum and what it was actually meaning when we kept hearing this said in the field internationally. But what does it actually mean for us in Australia? And what did it mean for two people working in higher education, for Kim in her role at the University of New South Wales, and for me in my role at the University of Melbourne? So when we were prompted by this beautiful generative abstract and invited to consider what does decolonising art education mean to us, we wanted to do this together firstly. And so I want to read our response first, and then I'm going to add some of the provocations that I've been thinking with and would love to have engaged with beyond this panel today out into the conference, because I think that it's the crux of what art education needs to look at right now. So I will begin by acknowledging that Kim and I developed this discussion for the World Congress 2023 across the lands of the Wurundjeri and Gadigal Peoples of the Kulin and Eora Nations. And we acknowledge their ongoing connections to custodianship to country through the land, waterways and skies as the longest continuous human community. We acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded and that we live and work on stolen lands. So together we wrote this response, and I want to begin with that and then add another layer to it. And Kim has sent me a video that I'm going to add on the end of here that I hope both contributes to the conversation, but maybe raises some other complexity. So in Australia, decolonisation and decolonial art education is both complex and contentious. And in 2023, even more so, in I think 40-something days, we head to a referendum that will recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in our constitution. Yes, Australia doesn't do that right now. So when you ask us to locate this complex issue, I think that's where I have to first go. I am wearing a yes badge for a reason. So both Kim and I work across art education in various ways, and we feel the very real tensions that exist in how to decolonise art education across these sectors, and whether or not it's even possible in a settler colony who is really only just beginning truth-telling processes. So in Australia, and here I'm quoting Kim, the very fabric, qualities and organisation of Australian land, landscapes and territories remain contested and the subject of many historical, political and contemporary artworks. That was Kim in 2019 in her work in the International Encyclopedia of Art and Design Education. So how do we then, thinking with that, reify how we're grappling with the past while trying to find and consider our futures with and for young people? Our communities of art educations are working hard to practice the shifting of colonial powers and colonial structures and ways of knowing, being and doing in the art curriculum to decentre the invader and reflect greater complexities, such as learning with the land, race, equality, equity, home, displacement, erasure. How do we actually begin to locate when, these are the big ideas and big questions and grand challenges that sit in front of us? So for me, I work in initial teacher education predominantly. My research is with young people around curriculum structures, particularly focused on land and climate through arts-based research. And so the kinds of things that I preface my own work with, and I'm going to read something of my own, is that I am always thinking about teaching, designing, and facilitating learning and creating learning encounters that ask and position a question of location around whose voices, whose bodies, whose objects and artifacts of culture, language and history, whose traditions, and whose spaces we are recognising, highlighting, reifying and erasing in art education. What are we prefacing? What are we enabling? What are we inviting into our room? Not when we think about a physical residency and we ask an artist to come and teach with us, but I'm talking about the kinds of artists within our conceptual framework of world and artists and audiences and artworks. They exist in our curriculums in varying ways, but we're in control of those things. So who are we letting in? And when we're letting them in, what are we opening up as art education for young people in our spaces? So when I think about ITE, I'm thinking about this ecology of education across sectors all the time. Because even though I work in initial teacher education, many of my Master of Teaching secondary visual art and design teachers will go into the museum or GLAM sector. They'll head into classrooms. Some of them stay in community-based art education in informal spaces. Some of them go back to their curatorial or artistic practices, and they take these pedagogies with them. So what kinds of methopedagogies am I actually creating encounters for, so that these teacher candidates can develop their own ways of dealing with this complex and contentious space and locating the kinds of historical, socio-political, cultural discourse in art education? So how do I do that? I try and locate the concept of these complexities at all stages. And one of those is for me to also think about the field and who I'm letting in. So when I ask them, who are they going to let in? Who are you going to teach with? Is it the dead white guys? Well, who am I teaching with? One of the things that I need to think about when I look at that question of decolonizing art education, and I think with the United Nations definition of decolonization here around equity, then what does that look like if I think about the kinds of people that I am letting into the room in terms of my scholarship? What am I locating in terms of, you know, both the concept of equality, but the concept of coloniality? And what does a settler colonial art education actually look like? Well, to me, that's problematic. And what it does is reify white, male, Western. So how do I decenter these practices? I have to make sure that I, not tokenistically and not in terms of numbers, but carefully curate a scholarly environment where I can have the discussion around what art education is around the world. And how do I locate what it is in Australia? I need to be doing some heavy lifting and publishing in my field, but I also need to be curating the kinds of scholars that will work together so I can preface the work of my Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander education scholars with my art education scholars. And if they are not my Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues, then I carefully pair work that will enable me in my classroom to let those discussions emerge, let the art education that is querying and questioning its focus in ways that my practitioners in the class can engage with the kinds of questions and interrogate this problematic. I think that decolonizing art education is a grand challenge for the field. I hope that you in the room take this grand challenge out of the World Congress and question what it actually means in a global context, because it can't be done globally, but we need to share with each other how we're dealing with these constructs and concepts and the kinds of even small activisms. And for me, the small activisms begin with who I let in my room. What art education scholars do my art teachers think of? If I think back to the 1980s when I was in high school, and we were asked to continuously look for women artists in the textbook, to me, I feel the same way about the kinds of scholars that I am providing to my students. Where are Indigenous and First Nations scholars in art education, and who should they be reading? where are the women and non-binary scholars that they should be reading? Because when they leave my class, I don't want them to think of the one dead white guy. And no offense to the dead white guys, but we need a broad, global, intercultural, equitable space to actually talk about what art education can be and might be. What are our speculative imaginaries?
Hello, it's Kim, Snepvangers here from Sydney, Australia. And welcome to the roundtable discussion. I hope you're all having a wonderful time on decolonisation, decoloniality in art education. Thank you to the North American World Councillors and Kate and other participants for the invitation. I just thought I'd sort of pose 3 propositions and questions that might be a response that the panel or the roundtable might be able to investigate. 1, what are the particular circumstances of settler colonialism in Australia, for example, in relation to higher education? It's a very potent point here in Australia. 2nd, what are some decolonial practices in your institution? And I'd be particularly interested in understanding their effectiveness and how they're being measured and why you think they were or were not effective. Thirdly, how do you address decolonisation in curriculum in your institution so that there's kind of a national and then a kind of institutional and then a more personal reflection possible with those 3 questions? Thanks and enjoy the conference, the World Congress, Fault Lines.